1870. Between 1870 and 1998, however, it increased by a factor of more than 6.5. By the end of the 20th century, thanks to myriad technological advances and improvements in knowledge, human beings on average lived longer and better lives than at any time in history. By working more efficiently, people had more than treble the amount of time available for leisure. Those who spent their free time campaigning for political representation and the redistribution of income achieved considerable success. Barely a fifth of countries could be regarded as democratic in 1900. In the 1990s, the proportion rose above half. New welfare states evolved that were pledged to eliminate want, disease, ignorance, squalor, and idleness, as the 1944 Beveridge Report on Social Welfare put it. To explain, in the context of all these advances, the extraordinary violence of the 20th century, it is not enough simply to say that there were more people living closer together or more destructive weapons. If those were sufficient explanations, the end of the century would have been more violent than the beginning and the middle. In the 1990s, the world's population for the first time exceeded 6 billion, more than 3 times what it had been when the First World War broke out. But there was actually a marked decline in the amount of armed conflict in the last decade of the century. Moreover, weaponry today is clearly much more destructive than it was in 1900. But some of the worst violence of the century was perpetrated with the crudest of weapons: rifles, axes, knives, and machetes. To understand why the last 100 years were so destructive of human life, we therefore need to look for the motives behind the murders. When I was a schoolboy, the history textbooks offered a variety of explanations for 20th century violence. Sometimes they related it to economic crisis. A favorite device was to relate the rise of unemployment in Weimar Germany to the rise of the Nazi vote and Adolf Hitler's seizure of power, which in turn was supposed to explain the Second World War. But, I came to wonder, might not rapid economic growth sometimes have been just as destabilizing as economic crisis? Then there was the theory that the century was all about class conflict, that revolutions were one of the main causes of violence. But were not ethnic divisions actually more important than the supposed struggle between proletariat and bourgeoisie? Another argument was that the 20th century's problems were the consequences of extreme versions of political ideologies, notably communism and fascism, as well as earlier evil isms, notably imperialism. But what about the role of traditional systems, like religions, or of apparently non-political ideas and assumptions that nevertheless had political implications? And just who was fighting the 20th century's wars? In the books I read as a boy, the leading roles were always played by nation-states: Britain, Germany, France, Russia, the United States, and so on. But was it not the case that some, or all of these countries, were actually empires rather than states? Above all, the old history books told the story of the 20th century as a kind of protracted, painful, but ultimately pleasing triumph of the West. The heroes, Western democracies, were confronted by a succession of villains, the Germans, the Japanese, the Russians, but ultimately good always triumphed over evil. The World Wars and the Cold War were thus morality plays on a global stage. But were they? And did the West really win the 100 Years' War that was the 20th century? I shall argue that historians' traditional explanations for the violence of the 20th century are necessary, but not sufficient. There is, in fact, no correlation over the century between the destructiveness of weaponry and the incidence of violence, nor can economic crises explain all the violent upheavals of the century. The Soviet Union, which started the war on Hitler's side, was cut off from the world economic crisis, yet ended up mobilizing and losing more soldiers than any other combatant. For the century as a whole, no general rule is discernible. Some wars came after periods of growth. Others were the causes rather than the consequences of economic crises. And some severe economic crises did not lead to wars. Certainly it is now impossible to argue, though Marxists long tried to, that the First World War was the result of a crisis of capitalism. On the contrary, it abruptly terminated a period of extraordinary global economic integration with relatively high growth and low inflation. The rise of new ideologies or the decline of old values cannot be regarded as causes of violence in their own right, important though it is to understand the intellectual origins of totalitarianism. There have been extreme belief systems on offer for most of modern history, but only at certain times and in certain places have they been widely embraced and acted upon. Anti-Semitism is a good example in this regard. Nor is it convincing to attribute the violence of the century primarily to the emergence of the modern nation-state. Although 20th century polities developed unprecedented capabilities for mobilizing masses of people, these could be, and were, as easily harnessed to peaceful as to violent ends. States could certainly wield more social control in the 1930s than ever before. If they wanted to conscript every able-bodied adult male citizen, they could. Yet all of these capabilities developed even further in the decades after 1945, while the frequency of large-scale war declined. Indeed, it was generally the states with the most all-embracing welfare states that were the least likely to be involved in war in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. It may well have been total war that made the welfare state, creating that capacity for planning, direction, and regulation without which the Beveridge Report would have been inconceivable. It was surely not the welfare state that made total war. Did it matter how states were governed? It has become fashionable among political scientists to posit a correlation between democracy and peace, on the ground that democracies tend not to go to war with one another. On that basis, of course, the long-run rise of democracy during the 20th century should have reduced the incidence of war. There is, however, at least some evidence that waves of democratization in the 1920s, 1960s, and 1980s were followed by increases in the number of civil wars and wars of secession. This brings us to a central point. To consider 20th century conflict purely in terms of warfare between states is to overlook the importance of organized violence within states. The most notorious example is, of course, the war waged by the Nazis and their collaborators against the Jews, nearly 6 million of whom perished. The Nazis simultaneously sought to annihilate a variety of other social groups deemed to be unworthy of life. Prior to these events, Stalin had perpetrated comparable acts of violence against national minorities within the Soviet Union, as well as executing or incarcerating millions of Russians suspected of political dissidence. A minimum estimate for the total victims of all political violence in the Soviet Union between 1928 and 1953 is 21 million. Yet genocide predated totalitarianism. Three things seem to me necessary to explain the extreme violence of the 20th century, and in particular why so much of it happened at certain times, notably the early 1940s, and in certain places, specifically Central and Eastern Europe, Manchuria, and Korea. These may be summarized as ethnic conflict, economic volatility, and empires in decline. By ethnic conflict, I mean major discontinuities in the social relations between certain ethnic groups, specifically the breakdown of sometimes quite far advanced processes of assimilation. By economic volatility, I mean the frequency and amplitude of changes in the rate of economic growth, prices, interest rates, and employment, with all the associated social stresses and strains. And by empires in decline, I mean the decomposition of the multinational European empires that had dominated the world at the beginning of the century, and the challenge posed to them by the emergence of new empire states in Turkey, Russia, Japan, and Germany. This is also what I have in mind when I identify the descent of the West as the most important development of the 20th century. Powerful though the United States was at the end of the Second World War, the apogee of its unspoken empire, it was still much less powerful than the European empires had been 45 years before. The world on September the 11th, 1901, was not a bad place for a healthy white man with a decent education and some money in the bank. Writing 18 years later, the economist John Maynard Keynes could look back, with a mixture of nostalgia and irony, to the days when the